Yeah. All right, welcome again to Social Distillation, the submarine still of the internet, where we attempt to drop the beat and pour white lightning straight onto your brain. What are we talking about today, Samo?
Well, we could talk about so many things in this day and age, 100 days with President Trump or all of these things, but we're not going to because that's annoying and it makes you grumpy. So we're going to talk philosophy today. Uh,
Well, in a way, the specific that we're going to take here, the specific example, and we'll hopefully try and add our own general ideas to it, is very important to this 100 days, first 100 days of the Trump second administration and the politics and all that, because right at the very beginning, Peter Boghossian uses his one of his collaboration slash writing partners, James Lindsay, as an example
mhm.
for, you know, he doesn't go into the depth, but what Lindsay calls the woke right of he has had speaking engagements canceled because he Boghossian is associated with Lindsay and we don't like James Lindsay anymore, so you can't come here.
hmm
And
And I would say some of that is on Lindsay's own feet because
yeah,
he's
yeah,
very snarky and disagreeable, and I think he feels betrayed because he helped this process so much.
yes.
But also, I also think he's not. Twitter is his worst, or X is his worst enemy because if you go to his YouTube channels, Conceptual James, his videos are like 4 hours long of monologue.
Hmm.
The things he talks about, you cannot put in a tweet. It's and I think he keeps getting himself in trouble that way. So he's kind of misunderstood, but it's a lot of it lays at his own feet. Peter's a lot better. He's better at being concise in his speech when he's on X, and he does a lot of polls and stuff. But he's a former ethics professor, so he knows how to talk these things out. And it's a great conversation on Dad Saves America, Peter Boghossian. And we're going to come at it. I think we should introduce ourselves for this one because we do have new followers.
Hmm.
It's not a Wheel of Time episode, and so it's more relevant for our backgrounds. You're a historian, and you specialize in what Japanese internment and things along those natures, right? And I'm a physiologist who is also training to be a psychologist. So it is, I come at things from more of a secular level, and you come from a historical and a religious level. When it comes to it's really relevant to this because we're going to talk the ethics of relationship
Hmm.
realistically. And that's
Hmm.
not relationship like sex relationship. That's relationship like everybody you meet, whether it's
Society.
yeah, it
Yeah,
could
that,
be just buying something from the checker at the store, that kind of thing.
yeah, they what they're essentially talking about is how do you construct a society? So on a big level, how do you construct an ethical, moral society that respects the dignity of the human being is
Hmm
something that concept and that term is something they get hung up on and talk about a lot, which is great because it's an interesting conversation. It's thought provoking, which it
It
needs
could
to be.
probably be a whole semester class.
Exactly. But then they kind of drill it down and as an example, all right, if we're going to construct this society on the macro level, on the micro level, that means I am kind to you and you are kind to me, and we let each other live our lives. And so kind of the meta idea is so Boghossian, the atheist ethics professor, is coming at it from the point of view of you do not need a supernatural reason to be able to come to the idea of the enlightenment ethics, generally speaking, that is their foundation of lowercase l liberalism, liberal democracy, those things. And Dad Saves America. This is I had heard of him. This is the first time I've actually listened to him.
Yeah,
He's
and,
coming.
and and for his from his perspective, he's an economist and a financier. So that's where he kind of comes at things from his perspective.
Yes, but also a more conservative Catholic.
Hmm
And so he's coming at it from the perspective of guys like Shapiro and Prager is in this camp as well. Of you cannot have a moral and ethical society
hmm
without God because boiling down their arguments, I think a good way to boil it down would be to simply say, because God by his nature creates ethics.
hmm And I would actually, this would have been a great, you just brought up a couple names. This would have been a great four-way panel because you could have had Prager and he would come up from a more Jewish perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so they use the word Judeo-Christian, but because you can't have Christianity without Judaism, but Judaism doesn't necessarily have Christianity, right? So you would have had that perspective and someone who's used to debating these things. And then I have a book up behind me, Robert Wright's Moral Animal. That would have been a good pair for
Yeah.
Boghossian, someone who's actually written some of the best books
Well,
on secular morality.
and you brought up Prager, and for some reason, the first thing to pop into my head was, or since I don't know how well Prager is after his fall, I don't know if he's back yet, or Shapiro. But the problem with Shapiro and why Prager would be a much better conversation is
Because he's
precisely
easier to
because of
listen to,
that,
first of all.
because he is a conversationalist. But
hmm
to your point about Boghossian versus Lindsay is what makes Peter so great here in this, and I've heard him before, but this is the first time I've really sat down and listened to him long form, is he is very good at disagreeing while still being agreeable.
hmm
And that's because he uses the term debate, and he says,
Well, he
hey,
follows the Socratic method. Is
yeah,
yeah.
hey, my at one point he says my rule is basically I'll debate anyone so long as you haven't insulted me.
hmm
Because if you've insulted, and it's not a ego thing, it's a, well, if you're out there flaming, trolling, insulting, then you're not an honest seeker.
Which
You're
we got
not
to
going to debate honestly.
we got to give Socrates some credit because he still debated and won over people who'd sentenced him to death. So
Yeah,
it's
exactly. And so that is, I think
Socrates denied.
Shapiro's great Shapiro's great flaw is, and why he's fine as a monologuing host, but not so fine in the back and forth. He makes for great viral clips because he's so combative, but the problem is he's so combative because
hmm
he's a debater. He is a debater in the legalistic sense, in the, I went to Harvard and I participated in debates and mock trials, and so I'm setting out to make my case and win it. And
Which
Boghossian and Prager are having conversations.
yeah, and I am succeeding in my endeavor into the social sciences, largely in part to Peter Boghossian, because before I started my stint back in school, I didn't read it, I listened to audiobook, his book, How to Have Difficult Conversations,
Mm-hmm.
Impossible Conversations. And it's all about how to talk to people that you disagree with. And there's a lot of, what about from this perspective? You ask a lot of questions. You say, oh, well, have we thought of this? Or, and you just kind of, you guide the conversation. You don't try to control the conversation. And that's been the secret to my success. And the fact that I get out of my classes where someone has an idea about me because I'm the only masculine white male to be in my program, I think. And they're like, oh, you weren't what I expected. And I've had people use those exact words. You weren't what I expected. I'm like, yeah, because you're being taught wrong, but that's not what I say. And so, but I do a lot of, well, have we thought of this? Or, hey, can we talk this part out real quick?
Mm-hmm.
And I learned that from Peter Boghossian, oh, and James Lindley. They wrote the book together. James should read his own book. And it's an amazing book. It's a 5 hour listen on audiobook. That's not bad at all. So it's probably a quick read.
Well, I actually, we've kind of segued here. I want to start at the end because I've got the timestamps up here to follow the flow of the conversation, and the final section is titled "Agreeing to Disagree is What Friends Do."
hmm
And from the very beginning, they say
Uncertain
we are
things.
friends, we are friendly, and um, well, expound on that on certain things.
I needed to smack my wife in the face because she disobeyed me. I can't agree to disagree with that person because they did something that is unacceptable.
Okay, that is a good point because, and this actually, I think, helps me flesh out the point I wanted to make. Um, because it is hard, if not impossible, to be friends, or at least friendly, neighborly, if you don't want to use the friend term, neighborly, because again, we're talking about societies on the macro and the
Hmm.
micro and how we construct them. If you do not have at least the same baseline fundamental worldview.
Yeah, and I think that's why this conversation was so good because they actually agreed on the baseline worldview. They disagreed on where it came from.
Because to your example there of, if I'm this super trad traditional Bible thumping guy, and I say, no, I am the patriarch, what
I
I say
am the
goes.
law.
All right, look, I can agree to disagree with that, and we can still be neighborly. But then if you take that too, so I'm going
The
to smack my
chastening
wife
rod.
around.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to smack my wife around.
Yeah.
Well, no, hold on. You've just a line there that violates fundamental tenets that I hold to be true.
Hmm.
We have to disagree now. We cannot agree to disagree. We have to either work this out, or there's going to be some problems here,
Hmm.
right? And th- this is the something I'd been meaning to talk about, which is Douglas Murray. And I thought
The
Constantine,
Dave Smith debate,
uh-huh.
yeah.
Yeah, Douglas Murray on Joe Rogan recently. And there's a couple different things I wanted to talk about. First of all, is and David and Peter here on this are other fine examples of, we talk a lot on both days, our social episodes and our Wheel of Times, about masculinity
Hmm.
and why it's important, but then more fundamentally, what does that mean?
Well, this is funny. You brought that up. I had no idea you were going to go that direction because of what you brought up with Lindsay with the woke right. This whole Dave Smith, Douglas Murray debate, notice it became about something it wasn't.
Yes.
Because I like both of them. I like Dave Smith and I like Douglas Murray, and I agree with them on a lot of things separately. And nobody's talking about the substance of the actual debate. They're talking
Mm-hmm.
about Murray's talking about experts and stuff. And if you actually watch that 3 hour debate, he's trying to argue, and he did it poorly, which is very rare for Douglas Murray,
Yeah.
but he did it poorly. Was that you there is a substance to having been there,
Mm-hmm.
because it's different to hear about people dying, and it's than it is to see the brutality that's going on. And it's easy to have your opinion, Dave, when you haven't been there because you're doing it by proxy. And Dave does have a blind spot. His blind spot is all this bad,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's the this what I call surgical strikes in Yemen, which is actually how these things should be. Only the bad guys are dying in those situations, versus the leveling of the ground that is happening in Gaza and Israel and everything. So you could have had a debate on the substance, but the debate around the debate is Douglas's use of you should
Mm-hmm.
listen to the experts, which we've all been very desensitized to
Exactly. Well,
over
and
the
that's
last few
that's
years.
why I thought at the absolute best take on that exchange was Kissen, because he was the
Hmm.
only one outside of these two old men yelling at the clouds who spoke to both sides and
And
understood where both sides were coming from.
and I even saw somebody, I'm trying to remember who it was, say I was wrong. I lumped Kissen in this debate in this
Mm,
box, and I listened to his response, and I was wrong. And I was like, there we go. Now we have dialogue. Let's continue that flow, because there are good points on the, well, you can't just level the earth in this place, but at the same time, Hamas is pretty fucking evil,
mhm.
so we've got to figure it out. And
Eh,
yeah.
my point on and why I brought up masculinity is because I think Murray in that situation in particular, but you also see it here with these two, is um the clip I played from a cartoon, a children's cartoon, of why why children in general, boys in particular, need good stories, is because you have a father character, and he's telling his 12-ish-year-old son a very basic, simple lesson on manliness and masculinity and what it means. And the phrase he uses is being a man means knowing where you're needed most.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it also means then standing that post, whatever that might be. So sometimes it's in that context, it was about a father going off to war and no, you can't come with me because this is your place here.
Mm-hmm.
So in that instance, it is standing, manning a literal post, in the military sense. But
One of
in
our
this,
big gripes about the freaking Wheel of Time show
yeah,
was why was nobody guarding the back door to the village?
yeah, where
They were all
who's
up the
supposed to be
front
standing
fighting,
that post?
but these kids
Um,
don't understand that there is a role, and if you don't see the combat, count yourself lucky. But if you do, that means something went wrong and you are playing a part.
mhm.
Yeah.
So Murray's post is he has been a journalist for decades. This going to a war zone, going to Israel, going to Ukraine, being on the ground and reporting. It's not the first time he's done that. Won't be the
Hmm.
last time he's done that. Probably does that probably. And yet you look there on that table, and who's the manly man? It's the dude who like power lifts and does jujitsu every day and, smokes cigars and drinks whiskey. Oh, Rogan's the manly man. And then you've got Douglas Murray here, who speaks in a very soft academic manner.
Yeah,
But
they're throwing out the theater kid. That's
exactly,
that's the insult they keep throwing out.
exactly.
Yeah.
They keep
Yeah.
throwing that. Oh, okay. Oh, because he's a theater kid, so you're going to insult him. Douglas Murray went on the largest show on planet Earth, stood up to the guy who represents ostensibly the side that Murray is most on and where most of his fan base is
Hmm.
coming from, and said, "Sir, you are wrong, and let me tell you why."
Hmm.
That is manning a post. Okay? That is masculinity. And it's not in the package that you would expect. And that's a lot of what is so infuriating about this, to your point, about the debate over the debate, is it's about the packaging.
Hmm.
Stop looking at that.
Yeah. And it's a distraction. I almost think that there are a lot of bots pushing this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Smith is not helping. I do not like his reaction to the whole thing. I wish he would have just got on there, debated, and called it a day, and let the people who watched it take what they would from it. And but he does have a blind spot, and the whole Libertarian Party kind of has this blind spot. All war bad. And
Yes.
it's like, no, I don't want to be funding these things. I don't want to be doing this. But at the same time, we have ships going through that channel, or we have, they are firing on our citizens. We need to defend ourselves. I gave the example of the guy sitting in front of the grocery store with a pipe. He's not moving anywhere, but he's whacking everybody in the knee that walks by. The
Yeah.
police still need to go in and get him out of there.
Yeah.
And that's, if it sticks with that, okay, I'm cool. But when we start doing it for other reasons, like regime changes in oils, I'm like 100% with Dave Smith. But he's there all the time
Mm-hmm.
and not situational. And I think sometimes Murray is the other way all the time and not situational.
And this is coming from the side that I just said, trad. They are the ones that are looking back at Chesterton's fence going, oh, this guy, this is something we should revisit. Well, okay.
It's just in
The,
case anybody in the audience doesn't know what Chesterton fence is. The liberal walks up to it and says we should tear this fence down. The conservative walks up to it and says we should keep this up. And the deep thinker walks up to the fence, Chesterton, and he says, "Why does this fence exist?" And that's the deep question. Yeah.
and to the point of the Dave Smiths of the world and the ultra all wars bad libertarians, you appeal to tradition frequently. There is a very, very long standing tradition called the just war theory.
Hmm.
You are not the first people to think about this. Maybe you should look and see what great thinkers of the past had to say about it and why they came to the conclusions they came to. And then maybe you could speak more. with a more informed idea on these issues.
Yeah, I would even say it's more simple than that because they're also all 2A supporters. And I'm like, why are you 2A supporter? Because you need to defend yourself against others and the government. Defend yourself,
Yeah.
defend others, defend. I am okay with war in the name of defense.
Well,
Yeah,
this actually segues us back to what we're supposed to be talking about, which is this conversation, because at the very beginning, the first section is the woke reign of terror over yet? And they both use that. I don't remember who uses it first, but they both use that phrase, reign of terror, and compare it to the Cultural Revolution and what happened under Mao. And yes, for the most part, overwhelmingly, especially when you talk about scale, the the cancel culture of the woke radicals in the Western world did not lead to the excesses of what the Cultural Revolution or the Stalinist show trials led to, but they were of the same intellectual school. They
mm,
both came from the same root thought. and that and so that's I think that's kind of Peter speaking both to Lindsay and to the people criticizing Lindsay
mm-hmm,
of, you're both in danger of doing this thing that you have spent years allied together criticizing.
mm-hmm,
And that is where I think Kissin's response to Murray versus Rogan versus Smith was the best take on it. Is Murray never said these people should not be able to speak their mind. He was specifically speaking to Rogan and, hey, you need to be better than that.
mm-hmm.
You should not have this guy on if you're then also not going to have on the esteemed person who says that guy's full of crap.
Well, and this is a yes and too, because this is where Murray could have done better.
Yes.
He could have said, it's not only just having this other person that disagrees on, doing like you're doing right this moment, having them both on at the same time. Because if I'm watching, oh, I like that guest. I like that guest and I'm on, oh, that's the guest I don't like because he disagrees with the guest I like. You're not going to watch it. So it's actually having them on at the same time. Maybe the evolution of the Joe Rogan show is more debates,
Yeah.
more long form debates on that. And that would be a natural evolution of something he had started. And
Mm-hmm.
he could take that responsibility or not. And but yeah, so that's actually that should have been the big takeaway. And I hate that it went the direction it is because people see the arguments about it and then they see it's a 3 hour debate and they're not going to click on it, right?
So something they bring up here at the beginning that sparked an idea that it has already been noodling around in the back of my brain, and I'm curious what you think about it. Um, is that I wonder if this woke reign of terror is, if not the root, at least the plurality cause of the boy girl divide in the young generation, because this woke reign of terror was an appeal to emotion.
Mm.
All these kinds of things always are. That's again
Well, it was
way
a
back at the.
mixture of appeal to emotion and overprotectionism. Heather and Brett talked about this the other day about the state of the medical industry right now.
Mhm.
Is the standard of care is basically the my kid has a stuffy nose, take him to the doctor response, right? We
Mhm.
have to protect everybody all the time. It, and it's kind of ruined medicine, and we see that same pattern with all the other industries that this has been.
And then, and fleshing this thought out a little bit more, the boy girl divide comes in is this toxic culture is going to inherently appeal to the feminine more
Mhm.
and repel the masculine. And as broken as our society has become, especially in regards to properly defining and helping youngsters explore masculinity and femininity, is there are still at least some outlets for masculinity.
Mhm.
You still have you still have sports. You still have competitive things, even if it's not a sport, even like video games inherently lead to the hierarchical and accomplishment focused things that are outlets for masculinity. I'm not sure there are outlets anymore for femininity properly defined because femininity has been hijacked by the third and fourth
I
wave feminists.
I would argue that that is incorrect because of the way the university system works now. Is that there's a reason why it's we're pretty close to 2/3 of all graduates are going to be female here in the near future.
No, that's my point. It
Yeah.
is there is no outlet for femininity properly defined. There are only outlets for toxic femininity and a narrative which feeds into that.
No, but they're still channeling that same propensity into the workplace. It's not being a mother, it's mothering people is where it's gone because they're all getting admin degrees. What is HR other than the mom?
Mm.
HR is the mom ridiculing you. You know, you wanted to jump the ramp and she's telling you not to do it, but you're like, but I made a perfect ramp, right? And so it is channeling in a certain way. It's just not the way nature intended is the problem.
Yeah, that is kind of my point. Whereas even if we do it on accident, there are still the way nature intended as you put it, outlets for boys
Well,
to explore masculinity.
let's pull this back where it was going because the argument of where it comes from. I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to give an evolutionary standpoint argument here for what you just talked about, even though I wasn't kind of planning on this, but comfort plays a role here. So, Western society, we're speaking of particularly, okay? The more comfortable you get, the more matriarchal it gets. And a great example, and I got Franz de Waal up behind me too, Age of Empathy, which is a great book about empathy and monkeys and apes, but chimps versus bonobos. They are so close in geographical nature and genetics that they should be pretty much the same. Except one's on one side of the river and the other's on the other side of the river, and one is lives a harder life
Hmm.
than the other. And so we think about chimps. If you know anything about chimps, they are vicious and they are very patriarchal. And the alpha tends to be the big, strong guy. Even though he does coalitional work, he is still he's the captain of the team. Okay. On the other side, it is a very lush environment, fruit everywhere, all the food you can eat. Everybody's comfortable. Bonobos like forage like 2 hours a day, and then the rest of their day they spend having sex and just hanging out. So they're actually a very matriarchal society. So the harder life is, the more the patriarchy comes forward. And the easier life is, the more the matriarchy comes forward because you have that luxury. And we're living in a day and age where we've shifted to the age of luxury. We should be thankful that we live in the environment that allows this to happen, but we need to be really diligent in the fact that that could collapse everything and make it. It's the old, hard times make good men make easy times.
Easy time make weak
Yeah,
men make hard times make, and the cycle repeats.
the cycle
Mhm.
repeats, and what we're trying to do is try to stave that off. And we have two very similar beings that live basically across a river from each other, and they're completely different results because one has it hard and the other has it easy. And right now, we kind of all have it easy. Even your
Yes.
trauma from your life is, we talked about it last time, switching high schools,
Hmm.
where the trauma from 300 years ago is, oh, a bear ate my brother. That's not so cool.
Hmm. Um, I think the so I went down each section and I made kind of a brief note on what I thought was either the main idea or the most interesting idea from that section. But I kept it brief until we got halfway through because I knew you mostly wanted to talk about essentially can you have a moral society that is also a secular society?
And more specifically on their topic was they agreed that you start relationships with dignity.
Hmm.
And I don't think Peter got it across of why that matters very well.
And I think the what I thought was, to me, the most frustration I had with the guy who was on my side, because you'd said you wanted to talk about this because you kept kind of yelling at Peter to, no, you should say this or phrase it this way to better make the point that I think you're trying to make. And I was the same on the other side of, well, wait a minute. So in the build up to that, I thought the next section is very interesting. It's Gen Z gets that mainstream media is all lies, which is true, and they cite the statistics. But
I
then it
still can't
occurs,
believe everybody always forgets about Gen X.
yeah,
They go boomers straight to Gen Z and I'm or straight to millennials and I'm like,
mhm.
what
Hey,
about
we're over here,
us?
dudes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Because we're all
um,
working hard and just keeping our heads down. That's what it is.
exactly.
Yeah.
But the thought that occurred to me is, well, wait a minute. You got to connect that with what you were just talking about, because there's an obvious question there, I think, which is, well, wait a minute. If the overwhelming majority of Gen Z has a low opinion of the corporate legacy media, then why do they all seemingly buy into the narratives of the legacy media? And it had occurred
Because
to me,
there are other sources. And one of them is the university system, as I just talked about. Yeah.
exactly,
Hmm.
is, but then the idea I had, the direction I went with it was, this generation's white guilt, which it's been a while since we've referenced it, but
Mm.
Shelby
Shelby
Steele's,
still, yeah.
his
Yeah.
book White Guilt is phenomenal. Um,
Which I loaned out years ago and I never got back. So,
um, he basically he makes the point that where the radicalism of the 60s and especially the 70s, where it got real crazy, where it came from is because when the discriminatory structure, political legalistic structure, was torn down, it exposed a hypocrisy in American society, and it left a vacuum, and that vacuum was filled by essentially the genesis of the 1619 project. It was a
yeah.
re-examination of America, that because there weren't enough or enough strong voices to fill in that gap and say, well, it's not a hypocrisy, it's a paradox, because instead what you got was an overwhelming narrative that, well, yeah, America not only is bad, it has always been bad.
Hmm.
And so we're going to build on top of that structure a better, something different. And this will be true utopia. And this is where the radical leftism of the 60s and 70s
Hmm.
came from. I feel like that is what is happening here with Gen Z, and to a degree millennials, who don't buy into the corporate legacy media narrative, but or media itself, but still buy into those narratives because it's the new white guilt. It's the new America has always been bad. It's just bad for slightly different reasons.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the points I wanted to touch on because they argued over where the basis for this comes from, whether it was because one of the arguments from David was Judeo-Christian culture is where all of these good things came from.
Mm-hmm.
My argument, if I was Peter, would have been that there was 3,000 years of that before it actually happened in the Enlightenment. And there's a pivotal moment there. What started the Enlightenment? If you were to put one thing on it, what changed with everything that pretty much accelerated the Michael Pollan, the ayahuasca guy, he would say it's caffeine, but I say it's something else because caffeine exists in all cultures.
I have a hard time pinning it to one thing,
It
but
is
since
one thing that took I mean, we're talking in scales of hundreds of years. So
Hmm.
the
But
Reformation, the printing
no,
press.
the roots of the Enlightenment are in the Renaissance, which predate the Reformation.
There is some of that, but I think what accelerated it, it was the gasoline on the fire.
Yes, that is certainly true.
Hmm.
My bias is economic history, and so
Hmm.
my first instinct, if I had to just pick one, I would say it was the economics that allowed for luxury beliefs, not the kind we have now, which
Yeah.
are very negative, but
Well, we
no,
talked about it in a previous episode. All
yes,
the greatest inventors were privileged people because they
they,
had
they,
time.
they either came from money or they what happened with some of them, like Da Vinci, I don't
Da
believe
Vinci was like the ultimate grant writer. He yeah.
they either came from money or they were people like Da Vinci or Voltaire later on, way later.
Hmm.
They had very wealthy sponsors who
Hmm.
were, the people behind the money, or the money behind the movement.
Hmm.
So there was an element of that, but definitely
There is a
the
thinking outside
gasoline
of
was the printing
authority
press.
is what I think really was the moment.
Uh-huh.
So you saw that in the Renaissance, but then you definitely saw it with the Reformation because the authority was the Roman Catholic Church, basically. And so when people started to be able to think freely, free thought accelerated everything. And yeah, because it no longer became the privileged. It was any everyday person that could learn to read that became like, hey, I have an idea. What about this? Or even the best question ever,
Well,
which
that
got me in a lot
you
of
you
trouble as a
say
child, saying why?
that could
Why?
learn to read, and the printing press made it easier to learn to read.
Well, I said that because almost
Yeah,
everybody can learn to read. You know,
right, right. So,
it's not a high what do we call it? High performance skill in my skill
mhm.
development class,
But
which
it
has
does take resources because in order to learn to
mhm,
read, you have to have something to
to
read.
read. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
So,
basically we've spent so much time in people being told what to think. And we had a moment in time where there were some free thinkers in the Renaissance that were really doing their thing, but it was available to everybody. And when it became available to everybody, that accelerated what became the American
mhm.
project.
Well, see, I think this is where David, the Dad Saves America host, probably got me most frustrated, is because there were moments here where they were having this conversation where they kind of came up against this impasse, if you will. And I think where David went wrong, and why a name that popped into my head when I was watching them is, I would love to see Peter Boghossian talk to like a true apologist. Because no offense to David, but he even admits, I'm not an apologist. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a
Hmm.
biblical scholar. You know,
That's why I said it would have been better as a
yeah.
four-way. Yeah.
But someone like Wes Huff, who knows the history as well as the theology and philosophy, I think would be awesome to listen to Peter and him go back and forth. But I think the fallacy there is you are looking at the house and ignoring the foundation,
Hmm.
because it was because of the existence of the church that there was even a foundation for the printing press and those Enlightenment ideas to build on in the first place. Um, and I think an example of this that I wrote down when I was taking notes is, uh, I don't remember where this was. I think it was in the section of getting America back to functional sanity. But I loved what Peter said. Quote, "We have exported a derangement syndrome," because they were talking about how the
Well,
rest
that
of
I mean,
the
that's why you
Western
have
world was
BLM
lagging
in
behind
Britain,
America.
right? You know,
Yes,
yeah, it's
exactly.
yeah.
But the reason we here in America seem to be hopefully turning the corner, while the rest of the Anglosphere, Western liberal democracy world seems to be accelerating towards the cliff, is, well, it started here.
Hmm.
It started here in academia, and then culturally, and for better or worse, this time worse, America is the prime exporter of pop culture.
Hmm.
That almost all pop culture in the media world is some imitation of the US, of
Yeah,
US pop culture.
anybody who's
Um,
a Rammstein fan the end of America is this is not a love song.
Yeah.
Basically, you are importing all of these things into my country
Yes.
that is destroying it. And
So
that's the
so
main point of the song.
Boghossian is of the opinion, quote, burn it all down. And I'll paraphrase his reasoning is that our institutions have become so infested by what he calls this derangement syndrome that they have completely portrayed the public trust. And David's response to that, as they're trying to establish where they are intellectually, ideologically, is I don't call myself a this or that. I'm an Americanist.
Hmm.
And it just triggered me because of actually something I heard Michael Malice say recently when he was on Gutfeld's show, and which is perfect because Malice has
I didn't know Malice got onto the
oh
Gutfeld
yeah, he's
show.
been on
Yeah.
a couple of times, and Malice's sense of humor just it's funny to watch Gutfeld lose it. Like he
Hmm.
just completely loses control of the show because he can't stop laughing. But basically, Malice said he was repeating something he'd said before, which is paraphrasing: conservatism is just progressives driving the speed limit,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
and that triggered me because this is building on something here.
I'm gonna add a word to what you just said.
Yeah,
Modern conservatism.
yeah, yep.
Yeah.
Well, see, I
Yeah.
would add a different word: political conservatism.
Okay, that might even be better.
Okay,
Touche.
so
Yeah.
so this is what I'm getting at: is this is adding to the people who are now catching heat and proving Lindsay right. And I just hope Lindsay is better able to articulate that. Are all of a sudden one of the founding members of the traditional masculine new right, if you will, Peterson, was back on Rogan, and he brought up this is not new. He has been saying this for years. And when he was saying it about Democrats and the left, we were all going rah rah of
Hmm.
what is your line? How do you identify the bad actors in your own movement? You need to figure that out so that
I
it
kind of
doesn't get
accidentally
there.
proved it on Timcast IRL. I made a comment. They were going back and forth, and Tim had the stupidest argument
Yep.
against Ian. And Ian's he's he's special. He's his own person. But they were talking about science versus religion, and the argument was that you're just taking the word of experts anyways. Because Ian's argument was, well, how do we know that Jesus did this? Well, because people told you. And he's like, well, how do you know graphene exists? Because people told you. And it back and forth. And I just made a comment on there that the thing about the scientific method is we build on other knowledge. And so the building on the knowledge actually proves the previous knowledge. Because you say you're doing something with gravity, Newton had to be right for the thing you're doing to be right. So and I just kind of made that comment. And the next commenter on there was like, oh, I see where you're coming from because you are a bitter atheist. And it just a tirade of all this stuff. And I was like, way to prove Peterson and Lindsay and all of these people right. You
Well,
just made the most psychopathic comment you could.
eh, whereas what you should do is rather than going down that rabbit hole and responding to that myself, I'll just say, uh, anyone who has a question on that should go watch Wes Huff's. I think it's titled "Can I Trust the Bible?" He has a number of them, and it is the essentially the science of the history of the Bible and why you can or cannot, if you want to go that route, trust it. Um,
Which
and
is where
and
Nietzsche
that's
got his whole like shtick from, I guess, you know?
yeah. So anyway, but his most recent reappearance on Rogan, Peterson reiterated this idea, but because he was pointing at the right, the same
And that's
they
what started the whole conversation that I responded to in that show. And I was like,
exactly.
yeah.
But this is where me being a giant dork comes in handy, and I wish more people with actual platforms would point this out. This isn't new. Okay. Peterson pointing out, hey, we need to be careful of the grifters who are coming in to monopolize this movement and then distorting it and turning it toxic if that's what is best for the influencer's brand. Okay. This isn't new even on the right, okay?
Which I'm wondering, and this, I hate to say the result proves the theory, but Tim was making what I thought was stupid comments because he was defending Candace Owens. And if Candace is a guest within the next
Mhm.
few weeks, I wonder if that was something prearranged and he couldn't, he was trying to keep the arrangement.
So the modern day, so maybe this is too harsh on him,
Well, and,
but
and he and he is kind of right about one thing because he's like, Jordan is specifically talking about Candace, which I think she's lumped in that. He wasn't
mhm,
specifically talking about her, but I think he knows she's one of the people because he
exactly.
had made a comment about Pharisees, and then he made the comment about Pharisees on the show, and he had made a comment to Candace about being a Pharisee.
Mhm.
So, but I think he's talking about a group. Phil did
Yeah,
jump in on this one. He said, "No, I think he's talking about a group."
yes.
And she just happens to be part of it in his mind.
So
And
coming from my dorky side, going all the way back to the late 90s, early 2000s, the number two radio show, distant second after Rush Limbaugh, um, on talk radio was Sean Hannity. There was a gigantic, relatively speaking, chunk of the intellectual conservative side that did not and still does not like Hannity. From the late 90s, early 2000s, there have been a chunk saying, stop listening to that guy. He's a grifter.
because he was Limbaugh's competition.
All right, time out because you caught me nodding and saying and that was a faux pas on my part because you hadn't finished your statement. And no, that's not right. Um, Rush had nothing to do with it. Rush was so far ahead of everyone, he was above all this.
Mm.
No, it wasn't that he was Rush's competition. What these people were pointing out at the time, and these were think tank people or people with smaller platforms, people who were primarily book and article writers and not hosts. What they were pointing out is that he's Rush's competition because he apes what Rush does, but at a much lower intellectual level, and I don't believe he believes it. So he's taking the
So
reason
the
Rush
empty
was
suit argument.
exactly
Yeah, yeah.
the reason Rush was so successful is, and I didn't think about this technical part of it until way late in his career, where someone called in and actually pointed this out, and he said, "Bingo, you are the first person on air anyway to ever get this," which is that stylistically, Rush as a kid wanted to be Casey Kasem.
Mm.
He wanted to be a top 40 radio DJ. He got into this talk stuff way later in life, but he took that same energy and style and transported it to talk radio, which always just used to just be, the hilarious skit with Alec Baldwin on NPR, and they're talking about his
Oh
sweaty
yeah,
balls,
yeah, yeah.
and it's the reason it is hilarious is because what they're talking about and the way they're talking about it, and it's all this, and it's so boring, and it's well, Rush took this energy of top 40 radio DJ and melded it with someone who was very well read and had thought deeply about stuff. His father and his brother, David, who survives him, um, they were both lawyers. And so his father, much like when RFK talks about how Junior talks about how RFK would encourage debates at the dinner table.
Mm.
And his dad, but Rush's dad was like that. Um, is no, he encouraged, well, why? Why, son? If I make a declaratory statement, he's going to pin me down of justify that.
Hmm.
So Rush would do these kind of shock jock ish kind of bits for fun and frivolity, but then he was always illustrating a real point. Hannity just gave you the red meat, and he never illustrated the deeper point because he either didn't believe it or wasn't smart enough to do
He
it.
had a list of talking points.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that is what Peterson is warning against. And
Hmm.
it's not new. So why people on the right are you so outraged when you yourself has been doing this literally ever since I've been paying attention to politics, which has been for way too long.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and it's just it. why is everybody arguing the fact that I mean I think a lot of these people haven't listened to the full clip where he's just like there is just a certain percentage of people that are psychopathic no matter what they believe. So they could believe the earth is flat and they're going to act psychopathic about that belief system. Why are we surprised that that would exist?
Mhm.
Why are you denying that that would exist?
One of the great failures of the right as a movement was Rush Limbaugh coined the term either after the 2008 or 2012 election. I don't remember which. No, it was 2012 because he admitted he had kind of drunk his own Kool-Aid and really thought because the economic numbers were not good in the 2012 election, and historically you don't win re-election as president if the economy is not good. And so he coined the term low information voter. The
Mm,
idea being, well, just there weren't enough voters, and he had statistical data, polling data to back this up, similar to the 2020 election and the number of Biden voters who said, buy a Hunter laptop. What's that? I have no idea what you're talking about. So, but so he wasn't wrong there. The failing on the right though was thinking that was a leftist phenomenon. No,
mhm.
we're human too, and so we are just as susceptible to that.
Well, I mean, we talk about a lot, and we have to be fair. We talk about TDS. There's also TWS,
Mhm.
and I think did we use this as a meme with the Peter Griffin thing? He says, and it had TDS on one side, TWS on the other side, Trump worship syndrome,
I
and
don't
he's
remember.
going, "Are you're both annoying?"
Yeah,
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 and he's
yeah.
just yeah.
Um, but this gets me to
Sorry if you're watching and I'm all over the place. There is a mosquito that keeps flying around my head, and I'm trying to get him, and he
yeah,
actually she, because the ones that
yep.
actually suck your blood are the female mosquitoes. The males are too small. Uh, well, that's how
Joke
insects
right
are.
now.
The males are
Yeah.
typically the small ones, or
Um,
yeah. So it's
along this same train of thought of this criticism is on the right, so why do you get all bent out of shape when it comes from someone who isn't technically not on your side? Is Boghossian um kind of makes this point when, to paraphrase, at one point he asked David that is this is this idea of the inherent dignity of man, and that is the core, the foundation of Western liberal enlightenment, all of these generic things we're talking about. Is this all Christianity or just certain flavors of Christianity? And that is actually a really good point. And I'm not sure exactly how, if Boghossian even knows how close to the mark he is, because this isn't his tribe, so to speak, right?
yeah. And this is where I was getting frustrated because they both kind of agreed on this concept that realistically, the words "all men are created equal" is a legal term. Because not all men are created equal. Some are bigger, some are smaller, some are smarter, some are
And they
nicer,
get into that, yeah.
and they get into this. But what I wanted to say was, but from a legal standpoint and from a relational standpoint, that's where we begin the conversation because we don't
Mhm.
know. And somebody might prove to be a psychopath. And I have to respond by treating them as if they're a psychopath, but I don't open with that. I open with benevolence. I open
Mhm.
with a universal humanity. And what I wanted to say was just bring up tit for tat. Axelrod, tit for tat is the best strategy. And what it is you start with benevolence and you respond accordingly. And that is the best strategy for survival for social beings since the existence of social beings. And I wish Peter would have been like, "Oh, we have this thing. We've been talking about it for many, 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 many years, and it is the best strategy for survival. That is why it exists." I think personally that argument would have helped a lot there.
Well, specifically on the the flavor of Christianity. Uh, actually, where I was going with it is I think Dad could have reinforced his own point if he had explored this because at one point I laughed and I had to write this down because I thought it was hilarious. Peter uses the term secular Swedes because Scandinavia has become incredibly secular, but that is what started this train of thought because I think the failing that we are seeing before our very eyes of Western Europe is a point in Dad's favor because they have been for a long time far more secular than the United States.
Yeah, except my argument here would be it has become more religious in a different way.
Yeah,
Because this is the primary reason all of the social sciences hate evolutionary psychology. Because evolutionary psychology came in and said, no, this is not how we're designed. And they said, oh, you're stupid. Everything is socially constructed. And that if the argument that Dad and you are putting forward was 100% true, I think EvPsych would not be the demon of the social sciences. Because they're unfortunate truths for that movement. They're unfortunate truths for the degradation of those societies. They're like, whoa, whoa, that doesn't even make sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Why are you saying that? No, it is this way and it's going to be this way. And yeah, the ideas of what you're calling secular social sciences are not evolutionary. The secular Swedes specifically.
they, oh boy, I'm trying not to go off on too much of a tangent here.
Well, I mean, anybody who's seen our show before when we've done Sunday school, and I'll label
Mhm,
this one Sunday school, we've argued not that the tenets and the literature of the Bible as a document for morality are wrong. We've argued where it comes from.
mm,
And I've
mhm.
said it's basically an evolution of humanity put in book. And you said, obviously you're more
Yeah.
religious than I am, so you believe it is God breathed. So yeah.
Well, not just that. No, I need to reiterate. Historically speaking, I think that's just factually wrong to say that it is an evolution because it is so small in the course of known human history across the world. The Judeo and then Judeo-Christian ethic is very, very small.
But also in that time frame, the acceleration of technology has been astounding.
Yeah.
The plow was the one before the printing press, right? It just
Boghossian, I can't remember the name of the guy he brought up who talked about that the internet was like the fifth revolution in communication. So is basically you have writing, the invention of
Mhm.
writing, and then
Which Socrates warned about as
for
was
a
going to ruin, yeah,
for a
ruin.
very long time, writing was very slow to spread and evolve
Yeah,
a
a
as
lot of
making it better.
when you read Plato, you're not reading Plato.
Hmm.
You're actually reading Socrates talking about what Plato
Hmm.
said
Hmm.
because writing was invented during
And
that
so
time. Yeah.
I can't remember this guy's name, but then he's the next one is the printing press. Think
Hmm.
about how long you're talking.
2000 years.
No,
More than
well,
that. When, when,
the
when was Socrates? He was like 500
no, I'm
BC.
just talking about the invention of writing, and I believe
We had to be specific. Phonetic language.
yes,
Because
yes,
I mean we have cave drawings and stuff like that
yes,
that are a form of
yes.
writing. But
So at least in the Western world, cuneiform I think is still the earliest documented, and I think that's 3 to 4,000 BC, somewhere in there. I can't remember exactly what. The printing press doesn't come along until 15 something, 1550, something like that. Okay. That's a really long time.
Hmm.
And then the third one he puts, I would have said the telegraph, but he says radio,
Hmm.
which makes more sense. That is a really long time, but not
We'll just
as
say long distance communication.
yeah. So really long
Well, then
time
you'd have to include pigeons.
from the
Yeah.
printing press, but not nearly as long as writing to the printing press. And then the next one he has is television, because now not only are you broadcasting voice, you can broadcast images.
Hmm.
That is a huge leap forward. Think about how close that was to the telegraph or radio, and then the internet. And think about how radically we have
I
changed
think people who
information
talk about
sharing
this
from the internet.
from a academic standpoint, they actually say the smartphone versus the
Mm.
internet
Mm-hmm.
because it put it in your pocket
Yeah.
and it made it available to everybody, just like the printing press made literature available to everybody. So yeah, I think most people would, a lot of academics would say the smartphone, but I think you can just lump them into available knowledge through the airwaves, right? It's just, yeah. The next one's going to be AI. AI is going to be the next
Yep.
one.
Yeah, they talked about that. That was kind of
Hmm.
scary, but they talked about that a bit at the beginning. Um, but I lost my train of thought. Oh, you interrupted me when I was bashing my own side.
Oh, okay.
Uh,
Yeah. Go
so
ahead
there,
and bash those conservatives.
well, Christianity specifically, this is what I meant by because it's not his tribe. I don't know if Peter Boghossian knew how close to the mark he was when he asked about is this all Christianity or different flavors? And no, that's why two of the best-selling books on the right now come from two lovely ladies. One is Toxic Empathy by Allie Beth Stuckey, who is a
Hmm.
conservative Christian and is writing about how this warping of what empathy is and taking it outside of what it is understood to be properly, as well as thus its proper application, has ruined the Christian right, especially because in a lot of ways what academia is to the left, the church is to the right. And where these ideas originate,
Which
the
is
good
why
and the
people like
bad.
Lindsay and I have been screaming because there is an echo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the other book that is a little more controversial is Megan Basham wrote a book called Shepherds for Sale. And it was about how and you actually saw some overlap of this on the reporting of this web of USAID money and where it was going and how it was getting there, that there a lot of these big time mega church, radio show book selling uh pastors in the what is now termed Big Eva, the big evangelical movement, they were getting money from Soros funded groups. Some of them knew it, some of them didn't, but they were all getting money from these groups and pushing this ideology. So the reason I'm bringing all this up is because if I had to say the one failing that frustrated me with from David's side is I don't think Peter got there, but I appreciated that he was trying to push down to a root. And I think a point David should have been making is we have become unmoored from that foundation. So he uses an analogy later of a boat on an ocean, and
Hmm.
that ocean has to be Christianity with the boat, the Christian ethic. And my point would be where you're going to get attacked, and Boghossian doesn't do this because again, he's a conversationalist and he's having discussions in good faith.
Hmm.
So he's not trying to do a gotcha. But where you're going to people who are going to try and get you in a gotcha, they're immediately going to start pointing to all these people on your side who contradict what you're saying.
Hmm. Which
And
would be like the giant waves in the ocean that could take the boat down, and
and and I would say, yes, you're proving my point because the reason those people on my side are undermining my side is they have become unmoored in this boat analogy, they have ripped free of their moorings and are now at the mercy of the elements.
And this is actually something I wish uh, Peter could have said, because he'd used the boat in the ocean analogy, is the boat protects you from the ocean. The ocean isn't your friend in that analogy. The ocean is, you drown. If you're a human being and you're just plopped in the ocean, you drown. The boat is what protects you from the ocean. And I think Peter might have tried to go there because he talked about how the American experience was actually an evolution of that thought. And David was trying to say, but it has to go from that. And it was like, well, but the just like air conditioning protects us from the heat, the boat protects you from drowning. So it was an evolution in a sense that we needed as humans to figure out something that protects us from this thing that has been created from something. So give David his credit. It is from something, but it is from becoming pro-social and needing guidance in that way. But also here are the failings of it. And so now we have to create another structure that protects us from it. We came here. The pilgrims came here because of religious persecution,
Mm-hmm.
right? That I mean that's the history of the last 6,000 years of humanity, was one evolution of evading what became religious persecution. And I think the latest version of that is woke. The freaking the Hebrews left Egypt, then we had time, and the Christianity movement left Judaism, the Reformation left Roman Catholicism, the Pilgrims left what was left by the Reformation, and we've just kept evolving from there.
So just random thought that you just sparked in my head. I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent, but here's here's a thought. What does anyone else out there think? If I'm onto something here, we should explore this a little more. Is that why the radical, woke, progressive, whatever you want to call it, movement is so almost uniquely toxic? Is because they're reacting to oppression that for the most part isn't real.
Exactly. No, I agree with that thought 100%. It is the proverbial boogeyman in the air. And so you have to have a religious non let me pick the right word, not allowing of dissent, which is one of the things about the American experience. Freedom of speech was the most important part of that whole thing,
Mm.
because you need to dissent, which is why the Reformation happened, because we had dissent. We had dissent over the authority. This is where, again, why I hate the way that Douglas Murray, and I'm glad you opened with that now, even though it kind of derailed me for a second, was so important, because they made the whole argument about the appeal to authority. We need dissent to actually flourish, because it brings the best out of us. All the evils of the world have been because of authoritarian oppression. Hitler doesn't work until he takes over and has control over everybody. Same with Lenin and later Stalin, right? Same with Pol Pot. All of these evils of the world are because one person or one group of people took complete control. That's why the American experience needs to play out, because we don't allow that.
Well, I think this leads us into the main question here and the main point of contention, which is can you have that absent a Christian society?
Yes,
Be
because I'll go back to my tit for tat. You have to open with benevolence and respond to malice. If you start from there, then you can have that.
let me give my what I think is my biggest critique of Boghossian and his thoughts here, and it's hard to boil down. And as we were talking before we started recording, do we have any clips? And it's hard to take a soundbite from this, you know,
Hmm.
and that's why it's so good. It's almost 2 hours of deep thoughts, but actual deep thoughts. Not although I could listen to Jack Handy's deep thoughts
Someone could
for
take a
two
clip from
hours.
our
Yeah,
conversation earlier when I said I need to beat my wife, and
yeah.
I said, but that's not a starting point I can start from. But they would take that one little clip.
This is two people having a thought experiment in real time. And they even reference Peterson and the way he squints and closes his eyes and pauses, and that's why they love him, but a lot of people it drives them nuts. And it's, let me think here for a second. How do I answer that? And not in a how do I rebut that so I can score a point? It's a that's a that's a good point. Let me think about what does that mean from my worldview, and so how do I best articulate this? It's not a tit for tat gotcha kind of thinking, but so I
But
highly
you
encourage
just
you to
used the term
listen to
incorrectly.
the whole
It's not
thing.
tit for tat if it's a gotcha. Tit for tat is honest.
It has a very negative
Yeah.
connotation colloquially
Yeah.
nowadays. So anyway, but so the question I kept wishing David would ask, and again, because I do think it rebuts, but then also I want to hear what Peter would have to say about this, is I think Peter answered his own question. I think Peter accidentally steelmanned himself or steelman David earlier in the argument, because I think the best rebuttal to what Peter says of, well, yes, you can have this same moral society that we have now that was built on Christian principles and Christian philosophy and theology. You can have it in a secular way because, and he lays out, a couple of different reasons. What does he call it? The practical and the moral. He makes the
Hmm.
practical and the moral case from a secular point of view, and that is obviously a good argument. He's an ethics professor. He knows how to craft an argument. But where I would rebut is say, okay, for the sake of argument, I will grant you everything you just said about the construction of same this idea that has the same conception of human dignity, and that it is important, which is at the root why we have this idea of rights and consent of the governed, and all these things come from this concept of human dignity and human worth. All right, broadly speaking. Here's the problem: how do you keep that society from if in a wholly or majority secular world? How do you keep that society?
I think Peterson answered that question. We have to find a way to identify the psychopaths because they always keep taking over. That's how you keep it. Because if everybody is going to live in this baseline of starting with dignity, even though we're all selfish in some ways, we need to we need to find a way to identify the people who are going to take advantage of that because the bad actors are always going to be the first to act. And we've done that over the course of history. But as we just talked about, the thousands of years between, the advent of language and the printing press, and then the hundreds of years before it was a telegraph, and then the less than hundreds of years before it was television, and then the less than dozens of years it was the internet.
And then a few more dozen, and it was the internet in your pocket.
Yeah, we haven't had time to adjust. We haven't had
Yeah.
time to adapt to that. And that's the space we're in right now. We're in a space where we have this new thing that people can take advantage of, and we haven't figured out how to not get taken advantage of.
Yeah, early on, he points out how the way TikTok in particular is constructed makes it uniquely toxic in this regard,
Hmm.
and that our brains just aren't. I think he uses the term, our brains aren't evolved to deal with this.
No, they're not. Evolution takes minimum thousands of years. And we've had it for what, 10-ish?
So I still think though that is not that is an answer, but it is not a sufficient answer for how you keep
No,
this.
this is where I would agree with kind of a religious bend on the thinking is we because it's so fast, we don't have time for our
Mhm.
physiology to change. So we actually do need to find systems to figure this out. And we've done that in the past through the meme that is religion. It is a system for helping us adapt to the new things in our life.
I'm glad you used that term because that is exactly where I was going, but I don't think I would have thought to use that term of a system. And this is what I mean by I think Peter answered his own question and why I wanted to hear him rebut his own steel man is because one of the things he says earlier that I loved is, quote, the means of error correction have been disabled.
Mm.
And that's what he's
Not
referring to
disabled, they're just too slow. They're just
when
too
he talks
slow.
about how, well, not just too slow, but now especially so when you're talking about these uh political institutions, and I lowercase p because I would add into those it's not just the governmental systems, but especially now as we see these revelations about things like USAID, is even these NGOs are highly political system and they are incestuous with the governmental systems. So all of these political systems that are supposed to act as guardrails, or as he puts it, error correction of, oh, hold on a second, no, we've gone too far that way, we need to pull it back. We used to have
Except
systems for that.
the first actors are always the bad actors. And we're in a time in place where the bad actors took control of those systems. So the error correction needs to happen. It will happen. That's the thing. For humanity to live on, it will happen. The problem is how painful is it
Well,
before it is corrected, and then what correction has to come later, right? So what's the next thing going to be? We said AI, but like something like space travel or something along those lines. What's going to be the new error that comes out of that new thing, and
yeah.
how long does that take to be
Well,
corrected?
okay, so space travel is an interesting point because we both liked at least the first season of The Expanse.
Yes,
Um
I liked what was it, 4 or 5 seasons of it?
there were four or five.
Yeah,
They were pretty good. The last one
it
was
did kind of
clearly
peter off a
rushed.
little bit at the end,
Yeah.
but yeah.
The first couple I think are really great. Anyway, but the reason I bring that up is because one of the central conflicts within that world, which is our near future, is, so what does it mean to be human now?
Mm,
Because is human only earthling? Because Martians, they literal Martians, humans have colonized and been living on Mars for enough generations that those people are physiologically different. The
hmm.
belters, the people that live out in the asteroid belts and on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, those people are even physiologically different from them because they're in even lower gravity.
As someone who's actually done research with NASA on this subject, if you grow up on Mars, you're growing up with a third of the gravity of
Mm-hmm.
Earth. So yeah, so maybe we have a system where we go and make a ecodome or whatever they do, right? That person that grew up there will not be able to come to Earth
Mm-hmm.
because they will walk out of that whatever spacecraft we have at the time, and every bone in their body would break. It would be like me dumping. So if you're 200 pounds, it would be like me dumping 600 pounds on you as soon as you walk out a door.
and
And
and so one of the first scenes in the first episode is, um I praised her because she's one of the few good actresses on the show. The woman who shows up to play Elida in
mhm,
Prime Video's so-called Wheel of Time is basically like I mean, what would she be like? Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, director of Earth intelligence.
yeah,
She's the person when it comes to security, and basically her justification for illegally torturing this person, gravity torture is what they call it, because this guy is a belter. He cannot live in Earth. They have to put him in a highly salinated solution of water to help support his weight. And they torture him by taking him out of that. And essentially they crucify him, because
Mm,
that's what crucifixion does to you, is
yeah.
your body sags down and your lungs can't fill and you suffocate over a very long period of time. That's why it's so awful. I digress. Her justification for that is the one we understand, which is, well, he's a terrorist. So that's the modern, that is the direct connection to the modern. But now the thought experiment comes in, and where you have to do a gut check on what you believe ethically is, he's also not really even human. He's a belter.
Hmm.
And so it is even more than, well, that's, you know, they're from California. They're weirdos anyway. No, we're going to another level because we can scientifically show, well, but here's the problem. They scientifically showed that all manner of people weren't really people back in the age of eugenics in the late 1800s and early
Hmm.
1900s.
Which is,
And
yeah,
and
that is a question of where the
and,
line is. Yeah.
and this is where I thought, this is the one part where I thought Boghossian wasn't really being in, perhaps not fully being in good faith here, is at the beginning of way later, and an hour and a half in, they get to a section that they call science, faith, and utilitarianism. And David is saying something about the problem with utilitarianism. And Peter says, I thought rather flippantly, you throw people in the ovens. Is that where this is going? Well, yeah, that's kind of an important question to answer, because
Hmm.
we need to answer it before we get there.
Yeah,
We,
this is
we
true. Yeah.
can't answer it when the trains are being loaded. That's too late.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that's really vague in the history of humanity because we have an example of that, and that's Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. At what point were the Neanderthals eradicated and how? And we don't know that.
Mm-hmm.
I know there was a lot of tribal warfare. I know I have Neanderthal genes because anybody who's
10%, I think.
European in nature, anybody who's it's weird because it's like Southern Africa and Japan are the ones that don't have it, which how they got to Japan before anything else, I don't know. But yeah, so we have to say, okay, so what happened here? Did we just integrate
Yeah.
or did we eradicate? How did that happen? And we don't we the fossil evidence doesn't point us in the right direction because it's hundreds of thousands of years ago. But you can do a genetic test and say, oh, you have some of that. And so what at what point are we here? Your example is science fiction, which is science fiction is the thought of experiment of what we
Mm-hmm.
think things will be. You know, we
Yep.
remember Back to the Future. We should have hoverboards and stuff like that right now, but we don't. What are they getting right? What are they getting wrong? And how do and I think this is where those kind of things come into play as we can have the thought of experiment of what is morally right as we
Mm-hmm.
go forward. The problem is science fiction actually didn't account for things like the internet. Because I brought it Back to the Future. They had hoverboards, but they didn't have the internet.
Yeah. And that's kind of wild that they couldn't even conceive that then.
Hmm.
Um, like even this thing, we talk about the supercomputer in your pocket, and
Hey, the
it is a
biggest lie you got in
supercomputer in your
grade school
pocket.
when if you're our
And
age, yeah.
so Star Trek kind of thought of this with the tricorder and the communicator, and it's, this
But it was
fancy
basically a
computer that fits in your
walkie-talkie.
pocket. But it was basically a walkie-talkie, and it wasn't. It was basically connected to the ship's computer. Well, which was basically a ginormous encyclopedia. The internet is so much more than that. And
Hmm.
they couldn't, even as far fetched as they were and how right they were in a lot of tech things, and they couldn't even conceive of the internet. Um, I think I wonder when the first kind of, this isn't my genre. I don't know if anyone knows the first kind of cyberpunky type stories where you have some kind of implanted device within your brain that lets you connect to electronic things. That might be the closest thing to the internet in science fiction, and I'm not sure how far back that idea goes. Um, anyway, the point being, it is a question that he asked, and I really need to know his answer because again, my prime rebuttal to what Boghossian was saying, in that it's my biggest question that I would want him to answer, is okay, yes, but what you've created here is a snapshot. And what we need to figure out, especially where we began this conversation, is but how do you keep it? How do you keep the institutions? What is the best, in his words, error correction device? And I think what David was saying, but not adequately articulating, is the historic evidence is the best error correction device is a healthy church.
I think it's too slow. I think it's too slow because how many years of slavery did we go through before the error correction happened? This is actually one of the weaknesses of Boghossian's argument, and I think he was trying too much to not have a gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Is this system that you say is the answer allowed this to happen for a very long time?
Well, that's why I use the word healthy on purpose.
Yeah, well, I mean, no, that, and I get you, but at the same time, every system is gameable. Every system has its
Okay,
good,
okay, no,
yeah, yeah,
that's a good point.
yeah.
Every system is gameable. Game theory, you know it better than I do, but basically it says any game can be cheated, so you need to find the best way for the most people to play
Mhm.
fairly.
Yeah, and there's so many things that also go into game theory is so you've got tit for tat, which is the basic. So to explain that to anybody listening is I go in if it's my turn to go first, I go in with move nice. And the other person on the other side they say nice. So that makes my next move nice. And they say it's not nice, then my next move would be not nice because it is completely reactionary to the last move. And now then you get into other things. Okay, so what happens if we have what we call a signal error, which means I come in with nice, they come nice, I come nice, they come what appears to be not nice, but they weren't trying to not be nice. But then I come back with not nice, and now I start a bad not nice, you know, waterfall snowball going down. So we have to account for signal error. Then you get what's called forgiving tit for tat. Nice, 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 appearing not nice. Let me do nice again. Okay, they come back nice. Okay, then we keep going nice. So we have things to account for that. And so that's how kind of game theory works. We need to figure out what the best system for accounting for signal errors, accounting for benevolence, accounting for malevolence in a modern day and age where everything happens so fast because we have little computers in our pockets that have now AI that accelerate everything even more. And yeah, I don't think the old system, and I think what David was arguing for is this old system is the answer because that old system doesn't account for all of these things.
I I think that is a fundamental misunderstanding, or uh, bad description of what that old system is, because the system was not the mechanism of transmission, and
Well,
I
the
think
system
that's why you're
itself
saying
had
it's
to be
slow.
changed over time. You look at the adjustments that have been
Yeah,
made over the course of that system.
yeah, but any system should be changed over time, as so any the foundation is what matters, because you can renovate your house, and you should, as it grows older and conditions change. And so long as you have a solid foundation and know where and what your foundation is, because a pier and a beam is different from a slab, you can renovate without endangering the whole structure.
Okay, since I've only got like 10 minutes left, let me kind of this might be our agree to disagree moment as the other debate ended is you are correct with that statement, but my rebuttal would be that the foundation is based on best strategies for a social animal.
All right, so I think that's a good place to end it, but a good place to end it as a tease because I think we need to keep going along this line because I don't think we're at an agree to disagree moment yet. Because what I would say to that about that system is so I just kind of realized what I've been saying about Boghossian's baseline point and accepting that you could create a society that you would actually want to live in and having these ideals but being secular. My point is historically the best system for maintaining and advancing that kind of society is the Judeo-Christian based Western society. I think they get to this at the end
I will
about
agree with Western. Yes.
how do
Yeah.
you have a flourishing society? Any place that has tried to take the trappings of Western society and use them in a and achieve the trappings in a secular society, every single one of them have devolved into mass murder.
Okay, so let's end this talking a little bit of grappling and jujitsu. Okay. So you're playing a game, you're flowing with each other, but at some point you have to go for something. And the thing about secular Western society is when you go for something, you leave yourself vulnerable to something else. So if I want to go for the armbar, I am very vulnerable for you to sweep me and end up on top. Okay. And I think that's the moment we're in is if I'm flowing and I'm going for the next possible move, I am vulnerable. And what we became vulnerable to was woke as they began
Mm,
their because they're like, oh, well, liberalism is vulnerable to this. I'm like, yes, it actually is. Because you go into it with benevolence. Universal humanity, as I think Isomorphic commented on humanists at one point, you go into the relationship with a I'm going to be equal, I'm going to come in with kindness. And if I come in with kindness and you punch me in the face, it's already too late. Right? It's already too late. I already have a broken nose.
mhm.
And so that is the weakness of it. But it is also the best long-term strategy. So that's where I'm coming from on this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then we will continue on that line of thought next week, where I am sure we will solve this question for all time for everyone.
Yeah. And
No
my
doubt.
nose has been broken a lot, by the way. It doesn't look like it, but it has.
All right.
All right.
And then next time, though, we're going to go back to some Wheel of Time shenanigans and overthinking everything. And we are going to talk about Moghidian and Asmodean. We should be able to get through both of those as both a kind of psychological and a literary mechanically breakdown of those two characters and who they are and why they work.
Yeah. And yeah, considering how weak they supposedly were, they
Uh-huh.
got a lot of screen time in the books.
Yeah.
And Asmodean got none in the show, but Moggy got a lot of screen time in the show.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. We'll see y'all then.
Later.